Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. I'm Mr. 50mm. You might remember that in my last video that I did, I repaired an Olympus E1, and I tried to sell you on the idea of DIY repair life. In this video, I'm actually going to review said camera that I brought back to life, this Olympus E1. Yet another camera from the early years of digital SLR photography. So, we're going to find out, is there more CCD magic to be had in the Olympus camera system? Let's get into it. What is the Olympus E1? Well, this goes back to February of 2001. Kodak and Olympus announced that they're now super best friends. The two announced a cross-licensing agreement designed to expand the market for digital photography. Now, fast forward again to June of 2003, and Olympus announces this beast of a camera, the Olympus E1, a camera with Kodak sensor technology right inside of it. So the Olympus E1 is the company's first DSLR. It features a 5-megapixel 4/3 sensor made by Kodak. It's the KAF 5101C, and it's a CCD. It's this CCD. Isn't that something? The camera features an ISO range of 100 to 800, with the expansion option allowing up to ISO 3200. The camera's shutter can do 60 seconds to 1/4000th of a second, with the flash sync of 1/180th of a second. The finder has 100% coverage, and it has a magnification of 0.96. The E1 can shoot at an incredible 3 frames per second, and it has a buffer of up to 12 RAW files, which is actually pretty good. That's like a solid, 4 seconds of buffered shooting. Storage is done, of course, via CF card slot. And the autofocus system is a solid 3-point system, with the center being a cross type, with the sides not being cross types. Metering is done using a 49 segment system, and the rear LCD is a whole 1.8 inches. As seen here. The screen features 134 K dots. So many dots. The body is actually kind of impressive, being made out of magnesium alloy and having weather sealing. And all of that while weighing in at only 660 grams, roughly 0.66 plana, or 1.46 Yankee pounds. That's pretty lightweight for a pro DSLR. Now, consider the Nikon D1. That came in at 1,200 grams, or a lot more weighty. Now, another cool thing this camera has is that it actually has built-in sensor cleaning, or as Olympus calls it, supersonic wave filter. And that's actually awesome, and it is actually quite effective. Finally, the MSRP for the E1 was $1,699 in US buckaroos in 2003. That translates to roughly $2,900 USD in now dollars, or about the equivalent GDP of Saskatchewan, or, roughly $3,980 Canadian. Feel and experience. We'll start with the size. At 660 grams, this is actually pretty light for a pro build, which is one of the selling points for the smaller sensor size. Now, despite this, the grip on the camera is fairly deep, it's fairly ample, it's extremely comfortable. Another positive of having this smaller sensor was that lenses were supposed to be made so that they were either small, lightweight, or fairly quick, in that they'd actually have a couple f2 zooms. Now, overall, this means that the camera system was well balanced. Again, there were, however, some fairly heavy, chunky lenses, but again, like I said, they tended to be some fairly wide aperture zooms that were pretty high performance. Now, this camera was focused on good ergonomics, as were many of the era, and almost everything you actually want to manipulate can be done with just your right hand. I mean, almost anything. So the camera is fitted with 2 command dials. You have one on the top here, and one on the back right where my thumb is. The power button is easy to flick on or off on the top here underneath your PSAM mode dial. And in order to do things like change your exposure compensation or white balance, simply press the button and rotate a command dial, and you can do that alteration. Now, this works for things like selecting your autofocus points, your white balance, a bunch of things. The only options that kind of require left-hand use are the following. Your metering mode change, here. Your drive mode change, or bracketing, as well as changing whether or not you want single, continuous, or manual focus, autofocus settings. Now, the only thing that was kind of annoying was that changing your mode dial actually also required positive control. So you had to press your button down and then rotate, like so. It wasn't a unlock, click, and then move kind of deal. So you did have to either reposition your hand and press and rotate, or do that with your other hand. Now, I get that. This is just to make sure that you didn't bump the camera and then change your mode, but I do wish that they'd, done it a little bit differently, maybe a little less button pressy. Now, additionally, on the back of the camera, you will notice that there are 3 buttons on the bottom. They also require use of your left hand, but this makes sense that this has to do with image review and deleting stuff. So if you're using these buttons, you're already, your eyes are already away from the viewfinder and you are looking at the screen. So it's a kind of a natural fit for those buttons to go there. Now, if you're looking through the finder, you'll notice that the magnification is quite good, especially if you've used other DSLRs from Olympus, like the E300. Again, or other 4/3 SLRs. Now, despite the smaller sensor size, this actually feels more like you're looking through an APS-C size viewfinder. Oh, and random fun fact about this particular finder, the E1 supports different focusing screens, and there seem to be a pretty healthy supply of these on eBay, and I'll be looking into that for myself. Now, menus on this camera are also extremely straightforward. Now, let's have a quick look. Now, as you can see, try to get it closer, you really don't have a lot of options there. You got your shooting modes, your reviewing modes, and your 2 custom function things. And or wrench modes. It's not a lot, it's very straightforward. That makes sense given that it is a purely photo machine with no frills to distract you. However, one not so nice thing about the back of the camera, and that does have to do with the whole screen bit, is the screen itself. It is not only kind of small, but the fact is when you're zooming in, you can only really zoom in at 4 times display resolution, which means that gauging focus is actually sometimes difficult on the back of the screen. That being said, image review and going through menus, doing stuff on screen is fairly snappy. It's not super quick, but it isn't going to make you angry. And when you're actually shooting, the responsiveness of the camera actually isn't too bad. It's not the fastest. It is, however, better than an E300. But I wouldn't say it's as good as a 1D or a Nikon D1. Focus on this camera does feel dopier than if you're used to shooting with something like a 1D or, again, Nikon D1 of the era. But once it locks on, it's usually quite accurate. And it does feel like, it is able to quickly, reasonably quickly snap into focus on pretty easy objects. Again, this system only has 3 points, so it isn't going to be doing things like identifying, dogs or cars or people. It's just going to focus on a thing, and it's going to get it done. That being said, as with other DSLR phase detect systems, this system is fairly predictable. So even though it isn't super advanced, it is able to actually get some action shots with planning. Now, let's get into what it sounds like when you get a continuous shot going. Pretty great. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the batteries for this thing. These things seem to go on forever. I haven't actually charged up the battery since I popped the pack in here. So, you know, they go for a long time. And the pack itself is actually still sold online and at very reasonable prices. So if you do have one that has an original dying pack of batteries, might as well freshen it up with a new third-party set. Now, before I move on, I do want to say that shutter sound that we just experienced, it is very nice. It isn't a loud clunk, it's not whisper quiet, it just sounds pretty good. Maybe I'm just an odd fellow, but I like this shutter very much. The images. Right, let's get into the nitty-gritty. This camera sensor is the fabled 5 megapixel Kodak KAF. For stills, I think this is still a very fine camera. Sure, on a huge 4K display, it isn't quite gonna cut it, but for web use, for looking at photos on your phone, it's ample enough. And if you're into the whole AI upscaling thing, you know what? It'll do on any display. The sensor does also seem to have a pretty weak AA filter, so you can get some amply sharp images from it. Now, these images actually look pretty good, even when blown up. Again, if you're looking at it on a giant display, don't look super close, you'll see the pixels. Now, the next part I'm going to talk about is a tiny bit subjective, but for the look, many refer to this camera as having, you know, something to it, something unquantifiable, something that makes the images super great. Now, when I shoot this alongside other CCD cameras, I can't say for sure that I really do prefer them to, you know, other cameras. Like, let's say, the D200, the literal definition of perfection. But I did take the E1 out the other day, and I had my Nikon D600 former, like, with me. And I took a couple shots. I framed them up fairly similarly, and I put the, cameras to the test. And when I had a chance to review both the images, and I matched the white balances, I did notice that the E1 produced shots that had a nice color to them. The greens were greener, the overall tones were more vibrant, color was just punchy. So, that said, I can't say for sure whether or not this was a characteristic of the lens I was using and the lens I was using on the D600, or a bit of lens, a bit of sensor. Is probably a little bit of both, but I do think there's something to it. I might have to dig into this a little more in another video. That being said though, when I was shooting with the E1, I did notice that with this camera, I did end up finding a lot more shots that I liked when compared to shooting with other 4/3 cameras, like again, the E300 or the E420. I just happened to like the shots that came out of the E1 more. Now, I actually don't think entirely that it was CCD Magic, since the E300 also has apparently CCD Magic, but I think rather I was more able to quickly adjust what I needed to adjust on the E1 and get the shot. And when the E1 got the shot, it tended to be in focus, and exposure was good, and I didn't really miss the moment. So generally I think that the E1 just handled better, so I was able to get the shot that I wanted. All in all though, I do think that, there's something to all these internet comments that talk about the E1's color output. Now, again, that aside, When you're shooting, it's not just the camera that matters, it's the lens as well. And for the 4/3 glass that I do have to say that I do like the images that they make a lot. The one that I primarily like shooting with the E1 happened to be the 35mm f3.5 macro, or that 25mm f2.8 pancake. Now, I am looking at getting a few other lenses, but again, that's the thing with these 4/3 cameras, the lens selection is a bit bare. And, so what I said on the E300 review as well, it's just that these lenses tend to be harder to find and kind of a bit pricey. Now, last thing I want to talk about is high ISO. Now, for the E1, I do have to say, you probably do want to stay within your non-expansion ISO limits. 400 and 800 can clean up pretty well using modern noise reduction software, but 1600, 3200, they're a tough sell for this camera. At those higher ISOs, I think, when you shoot the RAW, you can probably still run them through noise reduction and you can probably make them work, especially if you don't mind the grainy look. And especially if you're shooting RAW anyways, you can at least save the detail. But I personally thought that when I saw these images, especially at 3200, it was a little too much for me. But that's just me. Onto the photo gallery. Do I think that the E1 is a good buy? Honestly, at the current rate, no. It's currently going for somewhere between 175 and 250 USD, with some outliers actually selling even beyond that. And for me personally, that's a bit of a tough pill to swallow, especially given the alternate cameras that also use the Kodak KAF sensor, like the E300, E400, E500, etc. Now, these cameras either tend to sell for a little less than the E1 and offer higher resolutions. Although, I will say that the E1 is, bar none, the best handling of the bunch, I think. Now, I haven't handled a E500, but I have handled the E400, and I've handled an E420 and an E620, which are similar ergonomics to their CCD brethren. And I don't imagine that the 500 is, better than the E1, since it is also a cheaper or lower tiered camera than the E1. Now, that said, if you're going to choose these just on ergonomics, E1 would be the top pick, especially if you can find an E1 for a similar price to these other cameras. Now, I'm likely going to be shooting my E1 more than shooting my E300 just because it feels better to shoot, and I'm an oddball person. But really, if you're just after that CCD experience, cheaper, or especially if you're after the CCD Kodak experience, there are cheaper options from Olympus to explore. Again, that being said though, I got mine through repair. So I did spend much less than the average selling price. So maybe that's the answer. If you come across the E1 for a good price or want to fix one up yourself, might be worth going for it. So that's all I got for the E1. If you want this video in a short form, the E1 is a masterclass in ergonomics. Almost as good at ergonomics as the D200. It's overall fairly responsive, AF is a bit dopey, but workable, and image review is limited. But I do get the mythical aura around the Olympus E1 and its image output. The colors are vivid, notable, and enjoyable. Now, I don't think that it's worth the going rate given the alternatives, but that's just me. What do you think of the Olympus E1? Do you have one of these? Do you want one of these? Or do you have other 4/3 cameras instead? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Till next time, bye!